Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another episode of Tabletops and Taverns, the show where I talk about topics related to tabletop role-playing gaming. The next few months will see the release of a few horror-related gaming accessories, from D&D's Curse of Strahd to Pathfinder's Horror Adventures. So I thought that this episode I'd shift gears from the pretty basic introductory stuff that I've been covering thus far, and move over to one of the more complex, in fact, if not the most complex topic that I've personally encountered in role-playing games: horror, terror, and fear in role-playing games. Now, we're just going to gloss over some things. We're not going to get super in-depth, but I'd like to cover some basic concepts and some basic techniques, and then see what people have to add on from there. One of the reasons that I consider these aspects of tabletop role-playing advanced and complex is because of the difficulty incorporating them into any genuinely in a genuinely effective manner. Horror is popular in literature, film, and so on and so forth because of the effects it has on the viewer. It's an experience, and one which is difficult to approach and duplicate in a tabletop game without a lot of effort. A lot of it is simply due to the nature of the game. You're in many tabletop role-playing games, you're dealing with people that regularly face danger, so getting the idea that simple danger, something that's going beyond simple danger, is key to the whole experience. It's harder to imbue a sense of dread upon a group that's talking and sitting and chatting around a table. I mean, let's be frank here. They're going to be comfortable in their own chairs and not really commiserating with the person that's going down the darkened corridor. There's often a disconnect between what a character should be feeling and what the player is feeling in that moment. And even the best of role players will sometimes have trouble translating it. Further, think about it. Just because you've horrified the character doesn't mean that's going to go ahead and translate to the player feeling it. And if you're not getting that player at least a little bit into the spirit of the horror game, then you're losing out on the personal experience. And that's kind of the point of playing anything horror related. At the very base, if you boil it right down to it, if the player's not feeling horrified, then why bother? Finally, one of the things that makes a difference or what makes horror difficult, is that what elicits horror or fear in various people will vary wildly. It depends on the person in question, their imagination, their past experiences. Fear, and more deeply horror, is a thing that is incredibly personal, very subjective. And in order to really get your bang for your buck with any sort of role-playing horror, you're going to have to tailor your attempts not only to your group, just like you would with any other thing, but also to the individuals within your group. Like, you're going to tailor any adventure to your group. But horror, you have to go that one step beyond and find out what the individuals within your group are going to be horrified by. It's and here's another issue, is that even if you get that kind of mix where you're pretty good at evoking horror, not everyone is always up for horror. And let's face it, it can disturb some people, especially if they've got a little bit of sensitivity to some things. So you'll want to be certain that your group as a whole is up for some sort of horror-based game. And if you come out and ask them, they'll be expecting it, either by the nature of the game you've announced that you're playing, or the fact that you asked. And if they're expecting it, then it makes evoking that horror feel even more difficult. Now, I should note that when I talk about horror in games, I'm not talking simply about games that incorporate horror movie style monsters, or the spoopy skeleton Halloween style stuff. I'm talking about the genuine article, horrific situations that make the characters, if not the players themselves, preferably both, squirm in their seats. As an example of how difficult it can be to accomplish this, keep in mind that there have been entire systems devoted to the horror role. And really, even for those who have played them, I mean, let's be honest. How many of your players were genuinely horrified at any point during their time playing? And how many were simply there just to craft the most badass or slick character they could with the rules presented? So instead of horror, you often get, well, goofiness. Oh my lord, there be a vampire in that there castle, and really odd takes off of that thing, or hey babe, 5 dots of presence here. How about we go somewhere and refill my blood pool? And and that's not horror. That's just using horror tropes in an almost ridiculous manner. That's not to say that every horror game ends up being that way, nor every horror game that uses some of the hinted at settings. But to be perfectly honest here, folks, you know what I'm talking about if you've ever played these sorts of games. So, let's get back to the task at hand and look at actually implementing horror in your game. And we should start with what is horror? Keep in mind that horror, terror, and fear are taken to mean similar things, but they are different. And they can work together to produce the desired tone of a particular piece. Now, Stephen King, decide what you want about his writings, but he has called out 3 types of terror which he uses. The gross out, which are things that produce a physical revulsion. Things that are like gore, or like just things that disgust you. And there's the horror, which are the unnatural things that you see. They're like the creepy monsters that you can't explain. The works of supernatural magic that don't fit in with your worldly experience. And then there are the terror. And those are things that mostly prey on your imagination. He used the example of going to your house and finding out that somehow, some way, every item in your house has been replaced with an identical substitute. You know something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And your own imagination ramps things up, and thus it is the worst of the 3. Now, there are some other categorizations of horror, things like body horror, things like psychological horror, things like cosmic horror if you're running something like Call of Cthulhu. Those sorts of things, or like gothic horror if you're doing Ravenloft, those sorts of things, those sorts of categorizations are fine, but touching upon them like that really brings genre elements into it that I like to try to avoid in these types of discussions. So when I present something that's suitable for both like Dungeons and Dragons and Shadowrun, even though they're in different genres, I'm going to try and present things that are useful for psychological horror and cosmic horror and gothic horror. You just kind of fill in the blanks yourselves. And as before, those 3 categorizations that Stephen King brought up, a lot of people may disagree with how simple that breakdown is, but for our purposes, it's going to suit nicely. And all of these can be implemented in most role-playing games to varying degrees one way or another. Before we go into specifics on the techniques of that, a few things have to be taken into account before you even start, and these are pretty important. First, as we covered before, are you trying to horrify the players themselves or the characters? It's an important focus because it's honestly easier to horrify the characters themselves, as it's often as simple as a die roll. But if your goal is to terrify the players and not just the characters, then you're going to have to go above and beyond, but also keep in mind that if you have the players invested in their characters, then if the character is properly horrified and not just through a simple die roll, the player is probably going to be too, because if they're truly invested in that character, they're going to be concerned about what's happening to that character. So it may be a once removed kind of horror, kind of like you're horrified for what might be happening to your friend or something, the character being an outside entity, but it's there and we can work with that. Alright, second is going to be, what is the duration of the horror segment of your game? Is it a one-off adventure with a horror theme? Is it just a few scenes within a single adventure? Or is it going to be an ongoing horror campaign, something like a full Ravenloft campaign? You're going to want to moderate your inclination to throw horror into every scene, regardless of the duration. Because the more that the players and the characters are exposed to horrific scenes, the less impact they have over time. You get a diminishing returns. I've run horror campaigns, mostly set in Ravenloft, which ended up being less memorably horrifying than an ordinary dungeon crawl, in which I've put just a few horrific scenes in there that really grabbed the attention. So if you're going to go for the long haul, keep in mind that it's not going to be like something that's going to be a constant thing, even if you go the long haul route. And in fact, it's better if it's not, because if you want the characters to last through a long haul route, then you're going to want to not drive them insane really quick. So now you've got an idea of whether you want to frighten the players or the characters, and how long term you want to keep all of this up. So let's go ahead and go about specific techniques and considerations. We're going to cover things that affect the players and the characters, but as for the duration of the horror in your game, whether it's a full-on horror campaign or just one or two adventures, that's up to you to decide based on your own needs. Just remember that caveat I said. Overuse of almost any of the techniques and any of the horror elements that I'm going to go into is going to breed contempt and reduce their efficiency, with a couple of exceptions. There's some things you can use over and over again, things like music and atmosphere, so on and so forth. Now, let's talk about horror games. Finally, there are theoretical or design techniques, and then there's practical or play techniques. And the design techniques are the things that you consider while you're writing the adventure and while you're preparing for the game. And then the practical techniques or the play techniques are things that you're going to use while you're running the game, and those are going to be more hands-on kind of things. So there are many essays out there on how to write horror adventures, and many good ideas amongst them. So I'm going to mostly cover the general things that you need to remember. Most important, as I've kind of touched on in my quick list there, most important thing to start with in a horror game, whether you're writing, whether you're running it, but we'll consider this as part of the writing because this is where you kind of make your notes and such for the adventure. Atmosphere, atmosphere, and atmosphere. It's important in any game, but it is absolutely critical in a horror game. A great deal of the effects of various types of horror come from their contrasting or the complementary environments around them. You probably don't want everything to be all brooding and dark all of the time, because while that certainly does enhance a sense of alien disconnection in terms of the players, and that may actually help in some forms of horror, but for the most part it gives the players little investment in the setting and little investment in their characters. As we discussed before, the more invested the player is in the setting or the character, the easier it is to bring the sense of horror about. It's quite all right to take a dive into the dour from time to time, so to speak, after the players have a reason to really care about their characters. But if you just start off with a whole dark and stormy and foggy forest and so on and so forth, then there's no empathy built up with the plight of the adventurers, and you're going to suffer in the long term. Investment in empathy are the key to impacting the players on an emotional level. I've mentioned that, not just the characters. But it's true of every genre. It's most true in terms of this particular element. You may note that a lot of the great horror stories are set in otherwise ordinary or peaceful landscapes. Small towns, farming villages, fishing villages, that sort of thing. If you'll note, Lovecraft set a lot of his in New England, and I believe Stephen King does the same. I'm not really familiar with a lot of Stephen King's books. I've read a couple of them. But they use this idea of this like pastoral surroundings that in some cases are beautiful. In fact, in the Ravenloft setting, they used to really stress the beauty of the environment and how the characters could, or how you should really focus on these broad vistas that just paint this romantic and, you know, in the literary sense, this peaceful background that then you can shatter or subtly distort with the introduction of threats from beyond. That'll give, you know, this like the idea of beauty or peace or even mundane existence is going to give the players a sense of belonging to that setting. And then you can go ahead and just twist that reality away as soon as they believe that they belong there. Now, when you're writing the scenario, once you've got the atmosphere set up, once you've got notes on what kind of atmospheric tone you want to go ahead and get into, you got to worry about pacing. The second most critical element of horror. Pacing is the rate at which tension builds and then dissipates. The rate at which plot points come up and then pass. And it's in a lot of like the heroic epics and so on and so forth, you got a very regular pacing up to a certain point, and then it comes down from there. You build towards a climax, and then you come down from there, and it's all very methodical. It's very expected, and it kind of builds up this heroic grandeur in the story itself. With horror, you're going to want to vary the pacing more than you would in, say, a political thing. With horror, the more you vary it, the less predictable the pacing is going to be, and the less predictable the pacing is going to be, the easier that it's going to be to get high points and low points to impact the characters. I go ahead. A lot of the best pacing techniques aim for a slow boil. This doesn't mean you're going to go forever with nothing happening, because that's just boring as hell. But you just gradually build the tension over the course of encounters that honestly they don't all need to end in combat. Remember, an encounter is just an interesting interactable event, not just another enemy to destroy. You can use encounters that are non-combat encounters, like a howl in the woods or strange shadows flitting at the edges of their vision. Even combat encounters can be used to manipulate the pacing, though. Imagine a group of hearty adventurers in a village investigating a series of attacks. They have all the earmarks of something dark, something like a wolf, but more. All the villages are just convinced that it's another wolf. I mean, that's scary enough for your average villager. Hell, they just want you to get rid of it. So you've got enough clues on your own to indicate, your characters have enough clues on their own to indicate that it might be more than a wolf. But the villagers, no, it's just a wolf, it's just a wolf. So the party ventures out into the wilds and tries to track down this so-called wolf. And after much tracking and creepiness, maybe shadows flicking in the corners of their vision and so on, they come upon a clearing and find just a hungry wolf. Maybe they dispatch it, maybe they tame it, whatever. But disappointed over their own overactive imaginations, and maybe feeling just a little bit paranoid, they go ahead and just, take care of that wolf, head back to town. absolutely convinced that they've solved the problem. And now that combat encounter has happened and has relieved the tension, then that's when the real monster can start stalking them on the way back to town. And you build up that tension again. And then the real monster, who knows? Who knows what it is? You leave that up to you. But the point of the matter is that they believe that they've already won, and then you take that away from them. Just varying the pace of events over time, as I said, just vary them can keep it interesting. You go ahead and just have a few things happen in quick succession and then nothing for a little while, or then the threat of something happening, so that about half the time when they expect something to happen, nothing happens. They're not going to be sure whether the next time the tension, the environment, the descriptions that you give are going to build towards them being jumped by something. They may not know whether the hammer is actually going to drop, and that kind of keeps them in a state of paranoia. The more paranoid the players, the more that they make their own sort of aura of fear that they go ahead and worry about. And let's see, something that can help with building a sense of dread and horror. As I said before, something like snatching victory out of their hands when they thought they had it, you go ahead and take it back, and they're still in trouble. Another thing that can go ahead and build that sense of dread is the removal of safety zones or their fallback zones, places where they can rest, things they depend on. Your typical D&D party is used to being able to fall back to town and rest and recover. Thus, the prospect of combat itself usually isn't that threatening to the party. Some DMs may try to build fear in a party by just upping the combat encounters, and that really just lends to a kind of a almost ridiculous grind. Consider this: if you gradually remove the safety nets instead of upping the combat difficulty, just even a somewhat mundane foe can all of a sudden pose a real threat if the party hasn't been able to rest and recover. This has the added benefit of making the characters value the NPCs more than they ordinarily would in a game. When's the last time you ran a game in a pretty standard fantasy hack and slash setting where they actually gave a shit about the innkeeper or the priest? But when they start finding the inn closed down due to a murder investigation, or the village priests that they relied on to come back and help heal them and cure them, they go in and he's gone, he's missing, and suddenly they're left to their own resources, and the world may become that much more frightening, especially if you're using it in conjunction with things that interrupt the character's ability to rest and recover on their own. A vampire that's hounding the party, for instance, instead of showing up and attacking himself, he may wait until they're sleeping, and then send wolves, rats, whatever, just various minions, to just basically hit and run them while they're trying to get a night's rest, prevent them from regaining their spells and abilities. And then over time, that harrying pace, all of a sudden they may have gone into this investigation thinking, oh, we can roll over anything that we encounter, but if you give them a few days of minor encounters with the inability to really rest and recover, you're starting to have fatigue set in, like an actual, whether it just be fatigue from the lack of spells and abilities, or fatigue in terms of the actual fatigue status. All of a sudden things begin to look a little bit more serious. And that kind of rolls in, to another option. Because now you're talking about game mechanics. And game mechanics present a couple more options. Back in AD&D 2nd edition, the Ravenloft campaign setting used something called fear and horror checks, and then later madness checks. They were a mechanical way to make sure that the characters reacting to a situation, when the players would happily just march them on, one hit point and good to go. Call of Cthulhu used sanity checks in much the same manner. Their characters could literally go insane upon seeing things. These mechanics all basically do one thing, and that is they limit player agency. While sometimes that can be heavy-handed, these rules make it so the player has to take into consideration what their character is doing, whether they can be affected, whether they can afford to ignore how their character would react in certain situations. Because they don't know whether that character is going to suddenly fail to react as they should in a clutch situation. A computer game that uses this kind of concept is Darkest Dungeon. You've got an affliction system that gradually the character's stress builds over time, and once it reaches a certain point, they have a mental break, and sometimes it can be a good thing, but usually it's a very bad thing. They start getting paranoid, they start developing various psychoses, and they become more difficult to control in unexpected ways. While this limits the player's ability to actually define what their characters are doing, whether it be in Darkest Dungeon or whether it be using one of the game system I just mentioned from a tabletop game, it really mimics the sense of stress in a foreboding environment with constant danger, and it really gives the players, not the characters, but the players, something to genuinely worry about. And they'll have to make this decision whether to sit there and fight on in the face of adversity, or actually break down and run and retreat, or risk breaking down in shock and terror when they don't expect it. You don't have to use the full version a lot of these things. You can use a minor version. I believe 5th edition actually has some sort of fear check or madness check listed in. I'll have to take a look at that. I think they actually do in one of their alternate rules in the DMG. Alright, so we've covered things you should consider while you're writing the adventure in general, and things that mechanics you should consider using, and this kind of bridges the gap from techniques that you can use while designing the game into techniques you can use while running the game itself. Go over a couple of these then. Most of these techniques involve increasing or sustaining immersion, and as a result, the atmosphere of the game. Because, as I've said a bunch of times so far, the more the characters feel immersed in the setting and the characters, or the more the players feel immersed in the setting and the characters, the easier it is going to be to bring that sense of horror to them. First, you're going to want to limit out-of-character chat once the game gets underway. And this is always kind of something that you're going to want to strive for, just because it helps people react in a more reasonable manner. You're not waiting for so-and-so to finish off chatting about whatever. But in a horror game, the last thing you want to do is, while you're trying to build up this sense of dread and telling them about this bone-chilling approach up to this castle's doors and how it might be haunted, giving them signs that they should probably turn back, and then you turn around and 2 of your players are off chatting about a collectible card game that they played earlier in the day. So that is something you want to avoid. Dungeon crawler or politically themed game may recover from that, but since you're spending most of your time in a horror game building horror, anytime you lose that momentum, that steam, that sense of immersion, that sets you back all the way to square one. You've got to start all over again. So it can be unrecoverable sometimes if a game session breaks down like that. In terms of descriptions, now it's an odd thing to say, but in a horror game, sometimes vague is better, especially if your characters aren't being confronted directly with whatever horror you have derived, but rather either their minions or signs of them. Now you can describe the environment and other elements of the game with whatever flowery prose you want. In fact, a good contrast would be to describe the character's surroundings and then be very vague about what they're actually facing until they're actually face to face with it. Describing a shadow at the edge of their village or the occasional glimpse of something. You're not certain what, but you think it had gray fur just darting in and out of the woods, or even just a sense of being watched. And that can ramp up their own paranoia, which, as I've mentioned before, is a very real way to let them scare themselves. If you're the kind of DM that can do various accents and voices, a horror game is an excellent time to break out those skills, just so long as you don't go over the top and get goofy about it. The more the players believe that they're talking to different characters and so on and so forth, the more immersed they are, and we roll that back into the more invested they are in their characters. Using a light ambient music or the occasional sound effect can be a good technique, especially nowadays. Back in my day, we basically had like tapes and CDs, and thus you had a very limited amount of utility on them. But if you can have some computer support, like in the terms of a tablet or a surround system or so on and so forth, you can have a list of selected titles and sound effects on your tablet or whatever, and just play them with a touch, with a touch of a button. Creepy sound effects, maybe something like some sort of atmospheric but subdued kind of music, like something from You. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He's a horror. He does various piano remixes on YouTube. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Just played at a low volume, nothing overwhelming, but during a low volume during certain descriptions or encounters, just to lend some atmosphere to it. You do not want the music to distract from what you're doing, but you want it to instead complement what you're doing, just to set the mood. Use a little bit sparingly, especially the sound effects, a little bit sparingly. What you can do on the sound effects is, instead of describing how the door creaks open slowly, you say the door opens and then play a creak kind of sound effect if you've got one. And the more that they can hear it and actually identify the sounds, it's going to bring up, feelings that they've already got associated with those sounds, which may very well, if their sound effects are creepy enough, then it may very well just do most of the work for you by recalling instances where they've been creeped out by similar sounds in their past experience. If you can control the environment you're playing in, that's a great thing too. Like if it's in your home, or if it's in a room that you own, then things like light levels, the ambient temperatures can help set the mood. Well, you don't want to get things too dark. One thing I've found that's great for horror games is to have the table itself well lit so they can see what they're writing, maybe by an overhead spotlight or something, and then beyond the players behind them, have that part dark. So, or at least dark end. Never underestimate things like setting, like the temperature of the room or the physical location of the room either. You're going to want your players to be comfortable and safe, of course. But things like having like a slight intermittent draft come up across when you're running some sort of ghost story, for instance, that can lend a lot of immersion to that. It can, especially if it's a very light draft. It's not a fan blowing on them and shit like that, but like crack a window open a little bit if it's drafty outside and you can afford it. You can go ahead and set things to just a little more chill than you ordinarily would. Not enough to make anybody sick or anything, but that whole cold spot thing when you're scared and you get that feel of a chill down your spine, that's a very real thing. And if somebody's actually got a chill down their spine because you've set temperature down a little bit, that can kind of build in towards the whole thing. Just don't take it too far. And all of these techniques do is that they don't cause the fear themselves, but they make the players physiologically more susceptible to frightening situations. If you can do this, and this is something I've done in a number of games, if you've got an empty, dark room adjacent to where you play, or better yet, windows, now not out into the street or anything, but windows into like a dark and creepy, like a darkened yard if you're playing at night. Put your players with their backs to those windows, or you put your players with their backs to the open room. because a negative space behind somebody, a lot of people find that real creepy, especially if there's some sort of mirrors in the peripheral vision, just enough to get them paranoid. I know a lot of people that freak the hell out at things like that, and if you put them in that situation, not enough to distract. I mean, if they're going to go off the rails and like be really creeped out by it, you may want to move them, but it'll nudge them in the right direction. It's one of those techniques that I've found works well. Your mileage may vary. Your mileage may vary on that one. And all of these are really just the tip of a great iceberg of techniques. There are as many techniques for horror games as there are people that run them, and every single one of them works a little bit differently. As with any type of game you run, practice is definitely going to improve your skills, and you're going to develop specific techniques that are more effective on your group. Make sure your group, just make sure your group matches what they want, or make sure your group knows what they want from a horror game, especially if it's a long-term one. Because if it's no fun trying to run one with people that genuinely don't like that sort of thing. There's definitely, there's definitely a lot of techniques I've missed with this. Just giving you a couple off the top of my head that I know of. If you've got techniques for when you run horror games, I'd like to hear about them. Share them in the comments below. Let's try and get a couple ideas thrown around here for the upcoming Curse of Strahd. Things that you found effective when you've been running horror games. Things I might have missed. Things I may not have made sense on, and you want a little bit of clarification for. But I think I'm going to leave it here with just those ideas floating on the surface for you. As always, if you like what you've seen, go ahead and leave a like. As I said, comment if you've got some feedback on horror games in general, and subscribe for more RPG content. For now, I'm gonna head out, leave you to mull these things over. Hopefully I've helped some people, and hopefully some people have found this interesting. Just enough to get the ball rolling, at least. Until next time, this has been the RPG Crawler. Take care and goodbye.